A mafia boss who never answers unknown calls picks up the phone at midnight. On the other end, a trembling church volunteer whispers that his son is dying on MS-13 Street, the most dangerous block in the city, controlled by his deadliest enemies. Richard Don has 10 minutes to decide: walk into an obvious trap, or let his only son bleed out in enemy territory while 20 gang members watch from the shadows. If this story's got you hooked, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I've got another story coming your way that's just as thrilling, maybe even better. You definitely don't want to miss it. Mary Washington's knees had been complaining for the last 3 hours, but she'd learned long ago that God's work didn't come with ergonomic accommodations. At 65, she'd been doing this midnight ministry for 7 years, handing out sandwiches, blankets, and the occasional prayer to the city's forgotten souls. Her shopping cart rattled with empty Tupperware containers as she made her way through the industrial district, humming an old hymn her grandmother used to sing. The street lights here flickered like they had commitment issues, casting the warehouse district in that special kind of darkness that made even brave people walk faster. Mary didn't walk faster. She'd made peace with death years ago, somewhere between burying her husband and watching her daughter move to California without a backward glance. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. But tonight felt different. The air had that heavy quality, like the city itself was holding its breath. She'd seen 3 police cruisers speed past in the last 20 minutes, their sirens wailing like electronic banshees. Something was happening, but Mary had learned not to ask too many questions in this neighborhood. Curiosity didn't kill the cat here. It just made you an accessory to whatever the cat was doing. She was wheeling her cart past the old textile factory when she saw him. A young man, maybe mid-20s, sprawled on the cracked pavement like a discarded mannequin. His designer suit, even Mary's untrained eye could tell it was expensive, was covered in dust and what looked suspiciously like blood. One of his Italian leather shoes had come off, lying a few feet away like evidence at a crime scene. "Oh, Lord," Mary whispered, her cart clattering to a stop. She looked around, her survival instincts finally kicking in. This was MS-13 Street. Everyone in the city knew what that meant. The spray-painted tags covering every surface weren't artistic expression. They were territorial markers, the gang equivalent of a dog peeing on a fire hydrant. Except these dogs had AK-47s and a reputation for violence that made the evening news on a regular basis. Smart Mary would have called 911 and kept walking. But Mary Washington had stopped being smart the day she decided to follow Jesus into the darkest corners of the city. She knelt beside the young man, her knees protesting with sharp pops that sounded like Rice Krispies in reverse. Up close, she could see he was breathing barely. His chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular movements. His face was pale, almost gray in the flickering streetlight, with a bruise blooming across his left cheekbone like a storm cloud. "Hey, baby," she whispered, gently touching his shoulder. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. His eyes remained closed, his body limp. Mary pressed 2 fingers against his neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, but weak and thready, like a whisper trying to become a scream. She'd seen enough death in her years of street ministry to know this young man was dancing on the edge of something permanent. Her hand trembled as she patted his suit jacket, searching for a phone or wallet. The jacket's inner pocket yielded a cell phone, one of those expensive models that cost more than her monthly rent. The screen was cracked but still functional, showing a lock screen with a photo of this same young man standing next to an older, white man in front of what looked like a mansion. Both were smiling, but their eyes held that peculiar emptiness of people who'd forgotten how to be genuinely happy. Mary tried swiping, but of course it was locked. Her tech-savvy grandchildren had tried teaching her about facial recognition and thumbprints, but she'd never paid much attention. Now she wished she had. Then she noticed something else in the jacket pocket. A small card, business card sized, with a single phone number and one word: Dad. Mary stared at the card for a long moment. Every instinct she had, the ones that had kept her alive for 65 years in a city that ate the naive for breakfast, was screaming at her to put the card back, call 911, and disappear into the night before whoever did this came back to finish the job. But those same instincts had also told her not to marry James Washington, and he'd turned out to be the best decision of her life. Sometimes instincts were just fear dressed up in common sense. She pulled out her own phone, a flip model from 2015 that her daughter constantly mocked, and carefully dialed the number. It rang once,
Twice.
3 times. Mary was about to hang up when a voice answered. Deep, controlled, with an edge that could cut through steel. Who is this? The voice didn't ask how the person had gotten this number, or why they were calling. It simply demanded identification with the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed, without question. Mary's mouth went dry. Sir, my name is Mary Washington. I'm a church volunteer, and How did you get this number? The voice was colder now, dangerous in a way that made Mary's grandmother instincts kick in. This was a man who hurt people. Not might hurt people, not could hurt people, did hurt people probably regularly and slept just fine afterward. I found it, Mary said quickly, her words tumbling over themselves. In this young man's pocket.
He's unconscious, sir.
I think he's your son. The card just says Dad, and there was a silence on the other end of a line so profound that Mary checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. When the voice came back, something had shifted in it. The cold was still there, but underneath it was something raw and primal. Describe him. Mid-20s, maybe 6 feet tall, brown hair, wearing an expensive suit. He has a small scar above his right eyebrow and where the single word cracked like a whip. MS-13 Street, near the old warehouse district. Sir, he's barely breathing. His pulse is weak. Should I call an ambulance? I don't.
No.
The command was absolute. Don't call anyone. Don't move him. Don't let anyone near him. Do you understand? Mary's heart was hammering now. Sir, he needs medical. I said don't call anyone. The voice had lost its control for just a moment, revealing something underneath. Fear, maybe, or rage, or both tangled together like barbed wire. Then it steadied. What's your name again? Mary. Mary Washington. Mary Washington, listen to me very carefully. My son has enemies. Some of them wear badges. If you call an ambulance, if you call the police, you might be signing his death warrant. Do you understand? Mary looked down at the young man's gray face, his shallow breathing. But sir, I'm 10 minutes away. Can you keep him alive for 10 minutes? I don't know. I'm not a doctor. You're the person my son needs right now. The voice had gentled slightly, though gentle was relative, like saying a shark was being nice because it only bit off your arm instead of your whole body. Talk to him. Keep him warm. Make sure he's breathing. I'm coming. The line went dead. Mary stared at her phone, her mind racing. Every sensible cell in her body was screaming at her to run. This was MS-13 territory. This young man was clearly involved in something dark and dangerous. His father's voice alone had more red flags than a communist parade. Smart people didn't get involved in situations like this. Smart people called 911 and let the professionals handle it. But Mary Washington had spent 7 years meeting people in their darkest moments. She'd held the hands of dying addicts, prayed over prostitutes beaten by their pimps, and fed homeless veterans whose own families had forgotten them. She wasn't smart. She was just faithful. She shrugged off her coat, an old thing from Goodwill, but warm, and draped it over the young man's chest. Okay, baby, she whispered, gently brushing dust from his face. Your daddy's coming. You just hold on, you hear me? Hold on. His eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. That's when Mary heard the footsteps. Multiple footsteps, coming from the darkness between the warehouses. The kind of footsteps that didn't want to be heard but couldn't help themselves because there were too many of them. She looked up slowly, her heart dropping into her stomach. Shadows were moving in the darkness, resolving into human shapes. Young men, most of them teenagers, wearing the distinctive blue and white colors of MS-13. They emerged from the alleys like wolves responding to a dinner bell, their faces hard with a kind of casual violence that came from growing up in a world where life was cheaper than bullets. There were at least 15 of them, maybe 20, forming a loose semicircle around Mary and the unconscious young man. Several had their hands tucked into their waistbands in that universal gesture that said they were armed and ready to prove it. The one in front couldn't have been more than 19, with tattoos crawling up his neck like ivy, smiled at her. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a cat that had just cornered a particularly interesting mouse. "Abuela," he said, his accent thick with El Salvador. "You should go home. This street, she's not safe tonight." Mary's hands were shaking, but she placed them protectively on the young man's chest. "This boy needs help." The leader's smile widened, showing gold teeth. "That boy? He don't need help no more, Abuela. He need a coffin." The other gang members laughed. Harsh, bitter sounds that had nothing to do with humor. "His father is coming," Mary said, hating how her voice trembled. "I just called him. He'll be here any minute." The leader's expression changed, hardening into something cold and satisfied. "His father?" He looked at the other gang members. "You hear that, Holmes? His father is coming." He turned back to Mary.
Good.
"We've been waiting for his father." And that's when Mary Washington, 65-year-old church volunteer who'd never hurt anyone in her life, realized something that made her blood run cold. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't a mugging or a fight gone wrong. This was bait. And she'd just helped spring the trap. What would you do if you realized you'd accidentally helped set up an ambush? Would you stay or run? The convoy of black SUVs materialized out of the darkness like something from an apocalypse movie, their headlights cutting through the industrial district's gloom with surgical precision. They didn't slow down for stop signs or traffic lights. Those were suggestions for people who feared consequences, and the men in these vehicles had spent their entire lives being the consequences other people feared. Richard Don sat in the lead vehicle, his .45 resting on his lap with the casual familiarity of an old friend. He'd stopped counting bodies years ago, somewhere around his 30th kill, when he'd realized that keeping score was a young man's game. Now, at 52, he understood that violence wasn't about numbers, it was about efficiency. About sending messages so clear that people understood them in their bones before their brains could translate. Tonight's message was going to be written in blood and fire. 2 minutes out, Victor said from the driver's seat, his scarred hands steady on the wheel. The man drove the way he did everything else, with the emotional investment of someone filing tax returns. "I count at least 20 heat signatures on thermal. They're not hiding, boss." "Good," Richard said, his voice flat. "Saves us the trouble of hunting them down afterward." In the seat behind him, 3 of his most trusted soldiers checked their weapons with practiced efficiency. These weren't the kind of men who appeared in police databases or left witnesses. They were ghosts who happened to be very good at making other people become ghosts. Richard's phone buzzed. A text from his informant in the police department. * major gang activity reported MS-13 territory. All units ordered to hold position and await SWAT. ETA 30 minutes. * 30 minutes. That was either incompetence or someone on the MS-13 payroll had made sure the cavalry would arrive fashionably late, after the bodies were already cold and the crime scene hopelessly contaminated. Richard didn't care either way. He'd be gone in 15 minutes. 10 if things went smoothly. 5 if they went very, very badly. His mind kept circling back to that phone call. The woman's voice, Mary, she'd said, had been genuinely frightened but determined. Not the voice of an actress playing a part. Not the calculated tremor of someone setting a trap. Just a scared old woman who'd stumbled into something way over her head and was too stubborn or faithful to run. The world was full of Mary Washingtons. Good people who believed in things like divine providence and human decency, who thought prayers could stop bullets and kindness could redeem monsters. Richard had killed enough of them over the years to know better. Goodness wasn't armor, it was just another target. But this Mary had called him, had stayed with his son, had put herself between Marco and whatever darkness had put him on that street. That counted for something. Not enough to make Richard believe in her God, but enough to make sure she walked away from tonight intact. "There," Victor said, pointing ahead. The scene materialized in the headlights like a Renaissance painting of the damned. His son, Marco, his only child, the one person in this world Richard would burn cities for, lay motionless on the pavement. Kneeling beside him was a small black woman in a worn coat, her hands pressed protectively against Marco's chest. And surrounding them in a loose semicircle, like demons at a prayer meeting, were the blue and white colors of MS-13. 23 of them by Richard's count, all young, all armed, all wearing the kind of expressions that came from growing up in a world where violence was the only language that mattered. The lead vehicle screeched to a halt 20 feet from the scene, the other SUVs fanning out to create a perimeter. Doors opened simultaneously, and Richard's crew emerged with the coordinated precision of a military unit, weapons raised, every angle covered. Richard stepped out last, his .45 held loosely at his side. He didn't point it at anyone, didn't need to. The message was clear enough just from his presence. He was Richard Dawn, the man who'd built an empire on other people's fear, and tonight someone had made the catastrophic mistake of threatening the only thing he loved more than power. The MS-13 leader, a kid who couldn't have been old enough to legally drink, stepped forward with the kind of swagger that came from being too young to understand mortality. His neck tattoos marked him as someone important in the gang hierarchy, probably a shot caller for the sector. Don Richard, the kid said, pronouncing it with exaggerated respect that was clearly mockery. You got our message. Your message, Richard repeated, his voice carrying across the street with unnatural clarity, involved putting my son on the ground? The kid smiled, gold teeth glinting. Your son?
Nah, man.
Your son just had some bad luck, you know? Wrong place, wrong time. Could happen to anyone. He gestured theatrically at the surrounding gang members. We just found him here, same as the abuela. We was gonna call you ourselves. It was a beautiful lie, delivered with the kind of confidence that might have worked on someone stupider. The problem was that Richard Dawn hadn't survived 3 decades in organized crime by believing convenient stories. Let me tell you what actually happened, Richard said, taking a slow step forward. His crew moved with him, a choreographed dance they'd performed 100 times. You grabbed my son at the charity gala. Probably drugged his drink, something fast-acting, maybe GHB or a benzo cocktail. You dumped him here, on your territory, and waited for me to come running. This is your declaration of war. The kid's smile faltered for just a second before reasserting itself. That's a hell of a story, old man. You got proof. I don't need proof, Richard said. I need a body count. The temperature on the street seemed to drop 10 degrees. Every one of Richard's soldiers tightened their grip on their weapons. The MS-13 members shifted nervously, some of them finally realizing that bravado and actual survival instincts were 2 very different things. But the leader held his ground because he was young and stupid and probably had something up his sleeve. You shoot us, Don Richard. You start a war you can't win. We got 300 soldiers in this city. You got, what, 50? Maybe 60?
You're old blood, man.
We're the new generation. And the new generation. We don't play by your rules no more. Rules, Richard said, as if tasting the word and finding it wanting. Let me explain something about rules, kid. Rules exist because people are afraid of consequences. You want to know why I've lasted 30 years in this business, while men younger and hungrier than you are fertilizing someone's garden? It's not because I follow rules. It's because I make sure everyone else is too terrified not to. He raised his .45, pointing it directly at the kid's forehead. Now here's your one chance at a rule that might save your life. You tell me who ordered this hit on my son. You tell me now, you tell me everything, and maybe, I let you live long enough to regret every decision that led you to this street. The kid's bravado was cracking now, real fear bleeding through the tough guy exterior. Man, I don't. 3 seconds, Richard interrupted.
3.
2. Wait. The voice came from Mary Washington, who had somehow found the courage or insanity to stand up, placing herself between Richard's gun and the gang leader. Her legs were shaking, but her voice was steady. Wait, please. There's been enough violence tonight. Richard stared at her like she was a particularly interesting species of insect. Ma'am, I appreciate what you did for my son. I genuinely do. But You need to step aside right now before you get hurt. I won't, Mary said, and Richard could see tears streaming down her weathered face, but she didn't move. I won't let you kill a child. That's not a child, Richard said, his voice gentle in a way that was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been shouting. That's a soldier in an army that declared war on me. And in war, Mrs. Washington, children don't exist. He's 19 years old, Mary said. Maybe 20. He's somebody's son, just like that boy on the ground is yours. If you kill him, you're just continuing the cycle. You're just. Mom. The word was barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a knife through silk. Marco was conscious. Richard's head snapped toward his son, his weapon still trained on the MS-13 leader, but his entire focus suddenly elsewhere. Marco's eyes were open, confused and pain-filled, struggling to process the scene around him.
Dad.
Marco's voice was weak, slurred. What's happening? Richard's jaw tightened. It's okay, son. I'm here. You're safe now. I don't. Marco tried to sit up, then gasped in pain. I don't feel good. Dad, I think someone drugged me. At the gala. This woman, she asked me to help her with something outside, and then... His eyes widened as memory returned. Then everything went black. A woman. Richard's voice went very quiet. Describe her.
Young.
Hispanic.
Pretty.
She said. Marco's eyes closed, then opened again with effort. She said her name was Carmen. Said she needed help with her car. I just wanted to help. And there it was. The truth Richard had already known but needed confirmed. This wasn't random gang violence. This was calculated, planned, executed with the kind of precision that spoke of someone with resources and intelligence. Someone had hired MS-13 to grab his son. Someone who knew his weaknesses, knew exactly how to draw him out, knew that Richard Don would walk into hell itself if his son was the bait. The question was, who? Richard's eyes locked onto the MS-13 leader, who was now sweating despite the cool night air. Last chance, kid. Who hired you? Who set this up? The kid's eyes darted to his fellow gang members, then back to Richard. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Man, we got orders from up top. Some dude, white guy, paid us 20 grand to grab your son and wait for you. Said to make sure we had enough bodies to handle your crew. Said. He swallowed hard. Said you'd come alone if it was about your son. Said you'd be vulnerable. And you believed him? 20 grand, man. That buys a lot of loyalty. Richard smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Mary had ever seen on a human face. 20 grand. You sold out to my enemy for 20 grand. He lowered his weapon slightly. That's almost insulting. My son's worth more than that just-in-watch money. Boss, Victor called out, his voice urgent. We got movement. Northeast corner, rooftop. Richard spun, his instincts honed by decades of survival. On the rooftop of the warehouse across the street, barely visible in the darkness, was the glint of a rifle scope catching streetlight. A sniper. Everything clicked into place in Richard's mind with crystalline clarity. This wasn't just an ambush on him. This was a elimination play. Grab Marco. Lure Richard to MS-13 territory, let the gang and Richard's crew kill each other, then have a sniper pick off whoever survived.
Clean.
Efficient. Devastating. And he'd walked right into it. Everyone down, Richard roared, diving toward Marco and Mary. The first shot cracked through the night, and the MS-13 leaders had exploded in a spray of red mist. Then all hell broke loose. The gunshot echoed through the warehouse district like the starting pistol at the Apocalypse Olympics, and suddenly everyone was moving, screaming, shooting at shadows and each other with the kind of panic that turned battles into massacres. Richard hit the pavement hard, his body covering Marco's as a second sniper round punched through the space where his head had been a millisecond earlier. The bullet sparked off the concrete, sending chips flying like shrapnel. Mary screamed, a sound that was equal parts terror and prayer, and scrambled behind Richard's abandoned SUV, her arthritis temporarily forgotten in favor of basic survival instincts. Suppressing fire, Victor bellowed, and Richard's crew opened up on the rooftop with everything they had. Muzzle flashes lit up the night like a demonic light show, the sound of automatic weapons fire turning the street into a war zone. The MS-13 gang members were scattering like cockroaches when the lights came on, some diving for cover, others returning fire with handguns that were criminally inadequate for the situation. The kid leader, the one who'd been talking trash 30 seconds ago, was now very dead, his gold teeth glinting in a face that no longer had the back half of a skull. Another sniper round took out one of Richard's soldiers, dropping him mid-run. The man went down hard, a bloom of red spreading across his chest. Professional hit. Center mass. Whoever was on that roof knew what they were doing. Victor! Richard shouted over the chaos. Get Marco to the vehicle. Now. Victor materialized beside them like a violent ghost, grabbing Marco under the arms and dragging him toward the nearest SUV. Marco was conscious but barely, his eyes glassy with whatever cocktail of drugs was swimming through his system. He tried to help, his legs scrambling uselessly against the pavement, but mostly he was dead weight. Richard provided cover fire, his .45 barking measured shots at the rooftop. He couldn't see the sniper, whoever it was had professional discipline, firing and relocating, never staying in one position long enough to become a target. But Richard could see the muzzle flashes, could calculate angles and trajectories the way other people did multiplication tables. The sniper was moving southwest to southeast, using the rooftop's AC units and ventilation systems as cover. Smart. Professional. Expensive. This wasn't some gangbanger MS-13 had promoted to rooftop duty. This was a specialist. Military training, probably ex-special forces, the kind of person who charged 6 figures for a contract kill and earned every penny. Which raised the question, who had that kind of money and that kind of vendetta against Richard Don? A third shot took out one of the MS-13 gang members who'd been trying to flee, dropping him face first into a puddle. The message was clear. Nobody was leaving the street alive unless the sniper allowed it. Mary! Richard shouted, spotting the old woman still crouched behind his SUV, her hands clasped in prayer like she could negotiate with bullets through divine intervention. Get in the vehicle. Back seat. I can't leave these boys, she shouted back, and Richard wanted to scream because of course she couldn't, because Mary Washington was apparently the only person in this entire godforsaken city with a functioning conscience. She was pointing at 2 MS-13 gang members, kids, really, maybe 16 or 17, who were pinned down behind a dumpster, crying and praying in rapid-fire Spanish. They tried to kill my son. Richard roared. They're children. Mary roared back, and the sheer audacity of this 65-year-old church volunteer yelling at a mafia boss in the middle of a firefight would have been hilarious if it wasn't so insane. Another sniper round. This one took out the windshield of Richard's SUV, safety glass exploding inward like frozen rain. The shot had come from a different angle. Southeast rooftop now. The sniper was moving faster, getting more aggressive, running out of patience or running out of time. Richard's tactical mind, the part that had kept him alive through 3 decades of gang wars, mob conflicts, and federal investigations, was running calculations. Police response time in this district was usually 20 to 30 minutes. The gunfire had been going on for less than 3. That meant they had maybe 15 minutes before SWAT rolled in with armored vehicles and enough firepower to level a small country. 15 minutes to figure out who was trying to kill him, neutralize the sniper, get his son to safety, and somehow keep Mary Washington from adopting every teenage gangbanger in the city. Victor! Richard shouted. Take Marco and Mrs. Washington back to the estate. I'm ending this. Boss, that's suicide. Victor had Marco halfway into the SUV, the young man's head lolling against the seat. That's an order. Victor's jaw tightened, but he nodded. You didn't question Richard Don's orders. Not if you wanted to keep breathing. He grabbed Mary by the arm, surprisingly gently for a man who looked like he ate nails for breakfast, and practically threw her into the back seat beside Marco. No. Mary struggled against Victor's grip. Those boys will die, Richard said flatly. Because that's what happens in this world, Mrs. Washington. Now get in the damn vehicle before you join them. Another shot. This one hit the pavement inches from Richard's foot, sending concrete chips flying. The sniper was targeting him specifically now, had been from the beginning. The MS-13 gang members were just collateral damage, bodies to add to the confusion. This was personal. Richard dove behind a concrete pillar, his mind racing. The sniper had the high ground, multiple firing positions, and professional training. Going after him directly was suicide. But staying pinned down meant watching his crew get picked off one by one until the street ran red. Unless Richard's eyes locked onto one of his soldiers, Tommy, a kid from Brooklyn who'd proven himself during the Irish mob conflict 2 years back. Tommy, the white phosphorus grenades. Third SUV, equipment bag. Tommy's eyes widened, then he grinned. It was the kind of grin that said he understood exactly what Richard was planning and thought it was either brilliant or insane. Possibly both. He sprinted for the third SUV, zigzagging like a rabbit on methamphetamine. The sniper fired twice, both shots missing by inches. Tommy grabbed the equipment bag, sprinted back, and slid baseball-style behind Richard's pillar. "You're gonna burn down half the district," Tommy said, breathless but excited. "Good," Richard said. "I own the other half." The white phosphorus grenades were military grade, the kind of ordnance that wasn't technically legal but was absolutely available if you knew the right arms dealers and had enough cash. They burned at over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit and created smoke so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Perfect for flushing out a sniper. Richard pulled the pins on 2 grenades simultaneously and hurled them toward the rooftop with the kind of accuracy that came from having played college baseball before his life took a hard left turn into organized crime. The grenades arced through the air like burning angels of death, trailing white smoke. They hit the rooftop and detonated with a sound like God clearing his throat. Instantly, the entire building was engulfed in brilliant white light and smoke so thick it looked like the apocalypse had decided to start early and start local. The sniper fire stopped. "Move!" Richard shouted, and what remained of his crew sprinted for the vehicles. The MS-13 gang members who were still alive and conscious saw their chance and ran like hell, disappearing into the alleys and side streets like water through a sieve. Mary was screaming something from the SUV, probably prayers, possibly protests, definitely nothing that Richard had time to process. Victor had the engine running, Marco secured in the back seat, and was ready to punch the accelerator the moment Richard gave the word. But Richard didn't move. He stood in the middle of the street, weapon raised, watching the rooftop through the smoke and flames. Because he knew something everyone else didn't. Professional snipers had escape routes. Always. Multiple ones. They never boxed themselves in, never put themselves in a position where one lucky grenade could end their career and their life. Which meant the sniper wasn't on that rooftop anymore. The realization hit Richard like a freight train, and he spun around just as a figure dropped from the fire escape of the building behind him, a shadowy silhouette descending with spider-like grace, rifle slung across their back. The figure hit the ground running, heading for a motorcycle parked in the shadows. Richard fired 3 shots, but the figure was too fast, too well-trained, dodging and weaving with the kind of fluid motion that spoke of years of tactical training. The motorcycle roared to life, and the sniper was gone, disappearing into the maze of industrial streets before Richard could get off another shot. But not before Richard saw something that made his blood run cold. In the split second when the streetlight hit the figure's face, he recognized her. Carmen Vasquez. Marco's date from 3 months ago. The woman Marco had been seeing before Richard had pressured him to end it because she was too working class, not the right kind of connection for a Don heir. The woman who'd smiled sweetly at family dinners and asked intelligent questions about Richard's import business. The woman who'd been so understanding when Marco broke things off, who'd said she just wanted him to be happy. The woman who was apparently a professional assassin. "Boss," Victor was shouting. "We gotta go. SWAT's 5 minutes out." Richard stood frozen, his mind reeling through implications like a computer processing a virus. Carmen had been in his home, had sat at his table, had met his crew, had gathered intelligence on his operations, his security protocols, his weaknesses. And the biggest weakness of all, his love for his son. This wasn't a gang war. This wasn't a MS-13 trying to expand territory or some rival mob making a power play. This was something far more dangerous. This was revenge. But revenge for what? Richard ran through his mental database of enemies, a catalog that could fill a phone book, trying to figure out who would send an assassin this skilled, this patient, this willing to play the long game. The answer hit him like a bullet he never saw coming. "Oh God," he whispered. Vasquez. 3 years ago. The territorial dispute in the South District. A Colombian cartel had tried to move into Richard's territory, pushing cocaine and muscle with a kind of arrogance that came from thinking American criminals were soft compared to their South American counterparts. Richard had responded the way he always responded to territorial challenges, with overwhelming force and absolute finality. He'd burned their warehouse, killed their soldiers, and sent the cartel leader back to Colombia in several different boxes, express delivery. The cartel leader's name had been Roberto Vasquez. And his daughter, his only child, the apple of his eye, the one family member he'd kept separate from the business, had been named Carmen. "Victor." Richard's voice cut through the chaos like a razor. "Get Marco to the safe house. Maximum security. Nobody in or out without my direct authorization." "What about you?" Richard was already moving, heading for his vehicle. "I'm going to finish what I should have finished 3 years ago." He climbed into the driver's seat, his hands steady despite the adrenaline tsunami crashing through his system. In the back seat, Mary Washington was cradling Marco's head in her lap, whispering prayers and checking his pulse with surprising confidence for someone who claimed she wasn't a doctor. Their eyes met in the rearview mirror. "That woman," Mary said quietly. "The one on the motorcycle. You know her." It wasn't a question. "I know who she is," Richard corrected. "I didn't know what she was." "What is she?" Richard put the SUV in gear, tires squealing as they peeled away from the apocalyptic scene. Behind them, flames were consuming the warehouse, smoke billowing into the night sky like a signal fire announcing the end of something. "She's a ghost come back to life," Richard said. "And she's here to kill everything I love." Marco stirred in Mary's lap, his eyes fluttering open.
Dad.
His voice was weak, confused. "What's happening? Where's Carmen?" She was helping me." Mary's hands tightened on Marco's shoulders, her eyes meeting Richard's in the mirror again. The look they shared needed no words. Marco didn't know, didn't understand that the woman he'd cared about, maybe loved, was the daughter of a man Richard had killed. Didn't know that every smile, every laugh, every intimate moment had been part of an elaborate revenge plot. Didn't know that he'd been nothing more than bait in a trap, 3 years in the making. "She's gone, son," Richard said, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "And she's not coming back. But I think I still love her," Marco whispered, and then his eyes closed again, unconsciousness reclaiming him. In the back seat, Mary Washington resumed her prayers, but her words had changed. She wasn't praying for peace anymore. She was praying for justice. And in the front seat, Richard Don made a decision that would either save his family or destroy everything he'd built. He was going to find Carmen Vasquez. And when he did, he was going to give her exactly what she wanted, a chance to finish their war face to face, with no more games, no more innocents caught in the crossfire. Just 2 killers and the debt that needed to be paid. The sirens were getting closer now, their wails filling the night like the screams of the damned. But Richard wasn't worried about the police. They could investigate all they wanted. They'd find bodies, shell casings, and burn patterns that would keep forensics teams busy for months. What they wouldn't find was evidence. Richard's crew had scattered like professionals, taking their weapons and any identifying materials with them. The MS-13 gang members who survived would tell conflicting stories that would muddy the waters beyond any prosecutor's ability to clarify. And by the time anyone figured out what had really happened on that street tonight, Richard would have already written the final chapter of this blood-soaked story. "Mrs. Washington," he said, his voice cutting through her prayers. "Yes. Thank you. For staying with my son.
For calling me."
He paused, searching for words that didn't come easily to a man who'd spent decades viewing compassion as weakness. For being better than this world deserves. Mary was quiet for a long moment. Then, I didn't do it for you, Mr. Don. I did it because that boy needed help, and helping people is what Jesus told me to do. But you should know something. What's that? That woman, Carmen. She's hurt and angry. She's lost someone she loved, just like you almost lost someone tonight. Killing her won't end the cycle. It'll just keep it spinning. Richard's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Sometimes, Mrs. Washington, the only way to stop a cycle is to end it permanently. And sometimes, Mary said quietly, the only way to stop a cycle is to step out of it entirely and show there's another way. Richard wanted to argue, to explain that her world of prayer and forgiveness didn't apply to people like him and Carmen, that some debts could only be paid in blood. But he didn't. Because somewhere in the part of his soul that he thought he'd killed decades ago, a small voice was asking a question he wasn't ready to answer. What if she's right? The safe house was 40 miles outside the city, buried in the kind of suburban neighborhood where people mowed their lawns on schedule and called the police if someone parked facing the wrong direction. It was perfect camouflage, a 3-bedroom ranch house with beige siding and a garden gnome collection that Richard had personally selected for maximum boring authenticity. Nobody looked twice at boring. Boring didn't get investigated. Richard pulled into the garage at 3:47 a.m., the door closing behind them with the finality of a tomb ceiling. Marco was still unconscious, his breathing steady but shallow. Mary had fallen asleep somewhere around mile 30, her head tilted against the window, her lips still moving in silent prayer, even in sleep. Victor was already there, along with Dr. Chin, a disgraced surgeon who'd lost his medical license after performing unauthorized procedures but had gained a thriving second career treating people who couldn't exactly walk into emergency rooms with gunshot wounds. Chun was expensive, discreet, and competent. The holy trinity of underworld medical care. Get him inside, Richard ordered, and Victor and 2 other crew members carefully extracted Marco from the vehicle, carrying him toward the house like pallbearers with a living casket. Mary woke with a start, her eyes wild with confusion before memory reassembled itself. Where are we? Somewhere safe, Richard said. It wasn't a lie, exactly. The safe house had security systems that would make Fort Knox jealous. Motion sensors, thermal imaging, reinforced doors, and enough firepower hidden in the walls to hold off a small army. Dr. Chin will take care of Marco. You should rest. I should go home, Mary said, but her voice lacked conviction. She looked exhausted, like someone who'd aged a decade in a single night. In the morning, Richard said. After we're sure there are no loose ends. What he meant was, after I'm sure Carmen doesn't know who you are and where you live. Because if Carmen had been watching Marco closely enough to fake a relationship for months, she'd seen Mary's face tonight. And a woman willing to orchestrate an elaborate assassination plot wasn't likely to leave witnesses wandering around with inconvenient memories. They went inside, where the safe house's bland exterior gave way to something far more functional. The living room had been converted into a makeshift medical suite, complete with monitors for stands and enough pharmaceutical supplies to stock a small hospital. Marco was already on an examination table, Dr. Chun working with efficient precision. Rohypnol, probably mixed with ketamine, Chin announced after a few minutes of examination and blood work. Nasty combination. He's lucky he didn't stop breathing. Another hour without treatment, and we'd be having a very different conversation. Richard's jaw tightened. Another hour. If Mary hadn't found Marco when she did, if she hadn't called, if Richard had been delayed even slightly, he pushed the thought away. Dwelling on alternate timelines was a luxury he couldn't afford. Will he be okay? Mary asked, hovering near the examination table with the concerned energy of a mother hen. He'll sleep for another 6 to 8 hours, then wake up with the grandfather of all hangovers, Chin said. But yes, he'll be fine. Physically, anyway. He glanced at Richard. Psychologically? That's above my pay grade. Richard nodded, then gestured for Victor to follow him into the kitchen. Once they were alone, he spoke in low tones. I need everything we have on Carmen Vasquez. Real name, aliases, known associates, training background, current location. And I need it yesterday. Victor pulled out a tablet, his fingers moving across the screen with surprising delicacy for a man whose hands looked like they could crush bowling balls. Already started digging when you ID'd her. Born Carmen Maria Vasquez, Medellin, Colombia, 1996. Father Roberto Vasquez, Medellin cartel mid-level operative who got promoted after the extradition wars. Mother died when she was 6. Father sent her to private schools in the U.S., kept her completely separate from the business. Until I made her an orphan, Richard said flatly. Until that, yeah. Victor scrolled through more data. After you hit her father, she disappeared. Dropped off the grid completely for 2 years. Then she resurfaces with a new identity, Carmen Rodriguez, and a job as a paralegal at a downtown law firm. That's where Marco met her. Richard's mind was racing, assembling pieces of a puzzle that was far more complex than he'd initially thought. 2 years. What was she doing during those 2 years? Victor's expression went dark. Best guess? Training. We've got unconfirmed reports of a woman matching her description at a private military contractor facility in Eastern Europe. Another sighting at a sniper school in South Africa. She wasn't just planning revenge, boss. She was becoming capable of executing it. And we didn't catch any of this during Marco's background check on her? The identity was clean. Professional grade. Whoever set her up with a Carmen Rodriguez persona knew what they were doing. Cost probably ran 6 figures, maybe more. Richard leaned against the counter, processing. This wasn't some grief-stricken daughter acting on impulse. This was a calculated, multi-year operation with significant financial backing and professional execution. Which meant Carmen wasn't working alone. Who's bankrolling her? Richard asked. Her father's assets were frozen after we killed him. The cartel moved on, installed new leadership. They wouldn't fund a revenge mission against an American mob boss 3 years after the fact. Too much risk, not enough reward. Victor was quiet for a moment then. There's one possibility you're not going to like. Try me. Antonio Salazar. Richard's blood went cold. Antonio Salazar was the new head of the Medellin cartel, the man who'd stepped into the power vacuum after Richard's war with Roberto Vasquez had decimated the old leadership. Salazar was young, ambitious, and smart, the kind of criminal who understood that the future of organized crime wasn't about territory and violence. It was about networks, money laundering, and legitimate business fronts. He was also Roberto Vasquez's nephew. Salazar's been making noise about expanding into U.S. markets, Victor continued. Nothing overt, just whispers and feelers. But if he wanted to soften up the eastern seaboard before making a move, taking out one of the major established players would be a smart opening gambit. And he uses Carmen as his weapon, Richard said, the pieces clicking together. Gives her resources, training, support. She gets her revenge. He gets to eliminate a competitor and test his capabilities against U.S. organized crime. Everyone wins. Except you. Except me, Richard agreed. A sound from the doorway made both men turn. Mary Washington stood there, looking small and tired, but with that same stubborn light in her eyes that had made her stand between Richard and the MS-13 gang leader. I couldn't help overhearing, she said, which was obviously a polite way of saying she'd been deliberately eavesdropping. This woman, Carmen, she lost her father because of you? Richard's jaw tightened. Her father was a drug dealer and a killer who tried to move into my territory. I did what I had to do. You killed him, Mary said. It wasn't a question. I removed a threat to my family and my business. It's what I do, Mrs. Washington. It's what I've always done. Mary walked into the kitchen, moving with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested she was in pain but refusing to acknowledge it. She pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited, her eyes never leaving Richard's face. And now his daughter wants to do the same thing to you, she said. Remove a threat. Protect what she loves. Do what she thinks she has to do. Do you see the pattern here, Mr. Don? I see a killer who needs to be stopped before she hurts more people I care about, Richard said coldly. You see a mirror, Mary corrected. And you don't like what's looking back. The silence that followed was heavy enough to collapse under its own weight. Victor found a sudden interest in his tablet, wisely deciding that this conversation was above his intervention level. Richard wanted to argue, to explain that there was a fundamental difference between his actions and Carmen's, between defending your business and seeking revenge. But the words wouldn't come, because somewhere in the part of himself he'd spent decades trying to ignore, he knew Mary was right. Carmen Vasquez was what he'd created. She was the natural consequence of a life built on violence and intimidation, the blowback that everyone in his profession knew was coming eventually but prayed would hit someone else first. She was his legacy made flesh. "What would you have me do?" Richard asked, and he was surprised by how genuine the question sounded. "Let her kill my son? Let her kill me? Forgive and forget, and hope she does the same?" "I would have you stop the cycle," Mary said softly. "I would have you find a way that doesn't end with more bodies, more orphans, more people like Carmen growing up planning revenge. I would have you be bigger than your worst impulses." "I'm a mobster, Mrs. Washington. Being bigger than my worst impulses would put me out of business." "Then maybe," Mary said, and her voice was gentle but unyielding, "it's time to find a new business." Before Richard could respond, Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway. "Marco's asking for you," he said. "He's awake and confused but stable." Richard moved toward the makeshift medical room, but Mary's voice stopped him. "Mr. Don, whatever you decide to do about that woman, remember, your son is watching. The choices you make tonight will teach him what kind of man you are, and what kind of man he should become." Richard didn't answer. He just walked into the room where his son was struggling to sit up, his eyes glassy but aware.
"Dad."
Marco's voice was hoarse. "What happened? I remember Carmen and then nothing. Where is she? Is she okay?" Richard pulled up a chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 52 years. This was the moment he'd been dreading, the conversation that would shatter whatever remained of his son's innocence. "Marco, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Carmen isn't who you thought she was." Over the next 20 minutes, Richard laid out the truth. Carmen's real identity, her father's death, the 3-year revenge plot, the assassination attempt. He watched his son's face cycle through denial, confusion, anger, and finally a kind of hollow devastation that was worse than any of the others. "She never cared about me at all," Marco whispered when Richard finished. "It was all a lie. Every moment, every conversation, every—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm sorry, son." "Don't," Marco said, his voice suddenly sharp. "Don't apologize.
This is your world, Dad.
This is what you built. I'm just collateral damage." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. "Marco, how many other Carmen Vasquezes are out there?" Marco continued, sitting up despite Dr. Chen's protests. "How many other daughters and sons and wives and husbands are planning revenge because of something you did? How many people wake up every day thinking about killing us?" "That's the cost of the life," Richard said quietly. "I've always known that." "Well, I didn't sign up for it," Marco shouted, then winced as the movement sent pain shooting through his drug-addled body. "I never wanted this, Dad. I told you that. I've been telling you that for years. But you just keep pulling me deeper, saying it's for my protection, it's for the family, it's for the business. When does it end?" Richard had no answer. Because the truth was, it didn't end. It never ended. The cycle Mary had talked about just kept spinning, generation after generation, until everyone involved was dead or destroyed. Unless someone chose to step out of it. The thought was so foreign to Richard's worldview that it almost didn't register as his own. Men like him didn't step out. They doubled down, they escalated, they won or they died trying. That was the code, the unspoken rule that had governed his entire adult life. But looking at his son, his only child, the person he loved more than his own life, Richard suddenly understood something that had eluded him for decades. The code was bullshit. It wasn't some noble warrior tradition or necessary evil. It was just trauma dressed up in masculine mythology, a way for broken men to justify staying broken instead of doing the hard work of healing. And if he didn't find a way to break the cycle, Marco would either die young or become exactly what Richard was, A man capable of killing but incapable of living, surrounded by wealth and power but fundamentally, devastatingly alone. "You're right," Richard said, and the words felt like pulling teeth made of regret. "You never signed up for this. And you shouldn't have to." Marco stared at him, suspicion and hope warring in his eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying—" Richard paused, assembling thoughts he'd never allowed himself to think. "I'm saying that maybe it's time for things to change." A phone buzzed. Victor's burner, the one he used for emergency contacts. He answered, listened for a moment, then his expression went cold. "Boss, we've got a problem. Carmen just posted a video on the dark web. It's addressed to you." Richard's stomach dropped. "Show me." Victor pulled up the video on his tablet. Carmen's face filled the screen, and seeing her clearly for the first time, not as Marco's girlfriend or a fleeing sniper, but as herself, Richard was struck by how young she looked. 28 years old, maybe 29. Half his age. A lifetime ahead of her, if she chose to have one. "Hello, Richard." Carmen's voice was calm, almost pleasant, with just a hint of her father's Colombian accent. "By now you know who I am, and why I'm here. You killed my father. You burned his body and sent it back to Colombia like he was garbage. You destroyed my family." She leaned closer to the camera, and Richard could see tears in her eyes. Real tears, not the manufactured emotion of an actress. "I spent 3 years planning this," she continued. 3 years learning how to kill, how to plan, how to be patient. I got close to your son. I made him trust me, care about me. And yes, in case you're wondering, some of it was real. Marco is a good person, which makes him nothing like you. He deserves better than the life you've trapped him in." Richard felt Marco tense beside him. "I could have killed him tonight," Carmen said. "It would have been easy. A different drug cocktail, a different location. But I didn't, because Marco isn't the target. You are.
This was always about you."
She pulled out a photograph, holding it up to the camera. It was a picture of a young Carmen, maybe 7 or 8 years old, sitting on her father's shoulders, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. She was wearing a pink dress and holding an ice cream cone. She looked happy. "This is the last picture I have of my father before you killed him," Carmen said, her voice breaking. "I was 9 years old when men with guns came to our house and told me he was dead. 9 years old when I had to identify his body, what was left of it. 9 years old when I learned that the world was full of monsters who took things from people and called it business." She lowered the photograph, her eyes blazing with an intensity that reminded Richard uncomfortably of himself at her age. "So, here's what's going to happen, Richard. Tomorrow night, midnight, the old church on Mercy Street, the one that burned down 5 years ago. You come alone. No crew, no weapons, no tricks. Just you and me, face to face. We settle this debt the way it should have been settled from the beginning. And if I don't," Richard said to the screen, even though he knew she couldn't hear him. As if reading his mind, Carmen smiled. "If you don't show, I start working my way through everyone you love. Marco was just the opening act. I've got files on your entire organization, Richard. Every lieutenant, every soldier, every family member. I'll burn your world down one person at a time until there's nothing left but ashes and regrets." The video ended. The room was silent except for Marco's ragged breathing and the soft hum of medical equipment. "It's a trap," Victor said, stating the obvious. "She'll have backup, weapons, probably explosives. You go there alone, and you're a dead man." "I know," Richard said. "So we don't go," Victor continued. "We find her first. We take her out from a distance. We end this before."
"No."
The word came from Marco, who was struggling to stand despite Dr. Chen's protests. "No more killing. No more revenge. No more." He swayed, and Mary, who'd been listening from the doorway, rushed forward to steady him. "Sit down, baby," she said gently. "You're in no condition." "She's right," Marco said, his eyes locked on Richard's face. "Carmen. She's right about you, about this life, about all of it. You're a monster, Dad. Maybe you had reasons, maybe you thought you were protecting us, but that doesn't change what you are." The words should have stung. Should have made Richard angry. Instead, he just felt tired. I know, he said quietly.
So do something about it, Marco said.
For once in your life, Dad, do the hard thing instead of the violent thing. Find a way that doesn't end with more bodies. Richard looked at his son. Really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. Marco had his mother's eyes, soft and hopeful in a way that Richard had long since lost. He was standing despite obvious pain, speaking truth despite obvious fear, choosing compassion despite having every reason to choose revenge. He was everything Richard had tried to be before the world had beaten it out of him. You want to know what the hard thing is? Richard asked. The hard thing is admitting that I was wrong. That the life I built, the choices I made, the violence I justified, all of it was wrong. The hard thing is accepting that I can't fix what I broke, can't bring back the people I killed, can't undo 30 years of damage. He stood up, his decision crystallizing into something solid and unshakable. But I can stop making it worse. Boss, Victor's voice carried a warning. Whatever you're thinking. I'm thinking, Richard interrupted, that I'm going to that church tomorrow night. Alone, like she asked. No weapons, no backup, no tricks. That's suicide. Maybe, Richard agreed. But maybe it's also the only way to end this without more people getting hurt. Carmen wants justice for her father. She deserves a chance to face me, to say what she needs to say. And I deserve to hear it. Mary Washington stepped forward, her weathered hand touching Richard's arm. You're a brave man, Mr. Don. Braver than you know. I'm a scared man trying to do one good thing before it's too late, Richard corrected. There's a difference. He turned to Marco, drinking in the sight of his son's face, memorizing details he'd been too busy to notice before. If I don't come back from this. Don't, Marco said, tears streaming down his face. Don't say goodbye. Just promise me you'll try. Try to find a way that isn't more violence. I promise, Richard said. And meant it. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of preparation that looked nothing like Richard's usual pre-combat rituals. Instead of weapons checks and tactical planning, he spent the time with his son. They talked, really talked, about things they'd avoided for years. Marco's dreams of becoming a teacher, his frustration with the family business, his fear that he'd never escape the shadow of his father's reputation.
And Richard listened.
Actually listened, instead of waiting for his turn to talk or planning his counterarguments. He heard his son's pain and recognized his own role in creating it. Mary stayed with them, sometimes contributing to the conversation, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence, her presence a reminder that there were people in the world who chose kindness over cruelty, service over self-interest. As midnight approached, Richard prepared to leave. He wore simple clothes, jeans, a dark shirt, no jewelry or expensive watches that might identify him as a high-value target. He looked like a regular person, which was strange, because he couldn't remember the last time he'd tried to be regular. I've arranged for accounts to be transferred to your name, he told Marco. Legitimate investments, nothing that can be traced back to the business. Enough to live on comfortably if you're smart about it. Victor will help you navigate everything. Dad. And I've contacted a federal prosecutor I know, Richard continued, speaking faster now, trying to get everything out before his courage failed. If something happens to me tonight, they'll find evidence of all my operations in a safe deposit box downtown. Enough to take down the organization without implicating you. You'll be clear. Marco was crying openly now, and Richard felt his own eyes burning with unfamiliar moisture. Why are you telling me this? Marco asked. Because, Richard said, pulling his son into a fierce hug, I want you to have the choice I never gave myself. The choice to walk away, to be something different, to break the cycle. You don't have to be me, Marco. You were never supposed to be me. They held each other for a long moment, and Richard thought about all the hugs he'd been too busy or too hardened to give over the years. All the moments he'd missed because he was building an empire instead of a relationship. All the time he'd wasted being a monster when he could have been a father. Mary walked with him to the car, her small hand resting on his arm. You know, she said, I'll be praying for you tonight. For you and for that girl. You're both children of God, even if you've forgotten it. I'm not sure God remembers me, Mrs. Washington. God doesn't forget his children, she said firmly. We forget him, but he's always there, waiting for us to come home. Richard wanted to believe her. Wanted to believe that somewhere in the universe there was a force that cared about broken mobsters and orphaned assassins, that kept score of something other than bodies and betrayals. But belief was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not tonight. The old church on Mercy Street was exactly as decrepit as its reputation suggested, a burned-out shell that the city kept meaning to demolish, but never quite got around to. The roof was half-collapsed, the windows all broken, graffiti covering every available surface like urban hieroglyphics. It was the perfect place for a reckoning. Richard parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance, his hands empty, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't since his first kill 30 years ago. Fear, he realized. He was afraid. Not of dying. He'd made peace with that possibility decades ago, but of facing Carmen Vasquez and having no defense except the truth. The truth that he'd killed her father. That he'd destroyed her family. That he was exactly the monster she thought he was. She was waiting in what used to be the sanctuary, sitting on a piece of rubble with a rifle resting across her lap. The moonlight streaming through the broken roof painted her in silver and shadow, making her look younger than her years. You came, she said, and she sounded surprised. I wasn't sure you would. You gave me a compelling invitation, Richard replied, stopping about 20 feet away. And I'm tired of running from the consequences of my choices. Carmen studied him for a long moment, her finger resting on the rifle's trigger guard, but not the trigger itself. Do you even remember him? My father? Or was he just another name in a long list of people you've killed? I remember him, Richard said honestly. Roberto Vasquez. Mid-level operative for the Medellin cartel, ambitious, smart, too aggressive for his own good. He was moving product through my territory without permission, killed 3 of my dealers when they tried to stop him. So I killed him back. Burned his warehouse, eliminated his crew, sent his body home as a message. He was my father, Carmen said, her voice cracking. Not a target, not a rival, not a message. He was the man who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my homework and tucked me in at night. He read me stories and made me laugh and promised he'd always protect me. And then I took him from you, Richard said. And I'm sorry. That's not worth much, I know. Sorry doesn't bring him back, doesn't undo the pain, doesn't give you back your childhood. But it's true. I'm sorry for what I did to you. Carmen laughed, but it was a broken sound, more sob than mirth. You're sorry. The great Richard Don is sorry. Do you know how long I've waited to hear you say that? How many nights I lay awake imagining this moment, planning what I'd do when I finally had you in my sights. She stood up, raising the rifle, aiming it directly at Richard's chest. I was going to make you beg, make you crawl, make you feel a fraction of the pain I've felt every day for 3 years. So do it, Richard said quietly. If that's what you need, if that's what brings you peace, then do it. I'm not going to fight you. I'm not going to defend myself. You want justice for your father? Take it. The rifle wavered slightly. You think it's that easy? You think you can just give up, and that makes everything okay? No, Richard said. Nothing makes it okay. But maybe if I stop the cycle here, stop adding to the body count, stop creating more orphans and more enemies and more pain, maybe that's worth something. Maybe that's the only redemption I'm capable of. Redemption. Carmen spat the word like it tasted bitter. You don't get redemption. Monsters don't get happy endings. I know, Richard agreed. But you're not a monster, Carmen.
Not yet.
You're a hurt, angry young woman who lost her father and has every right to want revenge. But if you pull that trigger, if you become what I am, then I win. Because I'll have destroyed 2 lives instead of 1. Your father's and yours. The rifle was shaking now, Carmen's finger tight on the trigger. You don't know anything about me. I know you loved my son, Richard said softly. Marco told me about you, before he knew who you really were. He said you were kind, patient, that you listened to his dreams and made him believe he could be something other than what his father was. That wasn't all an act, was it? Some of it was real. Carmen's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. I hated myself for it. Every time I laughed at his jokes, every time I touched his hand, every time I... She couldn't finish. I was supposed to be destroying you, not caring about him. But he was so different from what I expected. So genuine and lost and trying so hard to be good in a world that kept telling him to be bad. He is good, Richard said. Better than me. Better than this life. And he doesn't deserve to lose someone else he cares about because of my mistakes. So what? Carmen demanded. I'm just supposed to forgive you? Walk away? Pretend my father never existed? No, Richard said.
You're supposed to make a choice.
The same choice I'm making tonight. You can kill me, continue the cycle, spend the rest of your life running from the Salazar cartel and my organization and the ghosts of everyone you hurt along the way. Or you can put down the gun, walk away, and find out what kind of person you can be when you're not defined by revenge. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple, Richard admitted. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, and I'm not even sure I'm doing it right. But I know that if we don't try, then nothing changes. We just keep killing each other until there's nobody left. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Carmen's ragged breathing and the distant sound of traffic. Richard stood perfectly still, waiting, ready to accept whatever came next. Slowly, painfully, Carmen lowered the rifle. I hate you, she whispered. I hate you so much. I know, and I hate myself for not pulling the trigger. That means you're better than me, Richard said gently. That means you chose to be something other than what pain made you. That takes more courage than revenge ever could. Carmen dropped the rifle, sinking to her knees among the rubble. She was sobbing now, great wrenching sounds that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken inside her. Richard wanted to go to her, to offer comfort, but knew he had no right. He was the cause of her pain, not the cure. So he just stood there, bearing witness to her grief, letting her mourn the father she'd lost and the revenge she'd sacrificed. After a long time, she looked up at him, her face wet with tears. What happens now? Now, Richard said, we both walk away. I'm leaving the life, really leaving, not just hiding and planning a comeback. My son is taking over the legitimate businesses, and everything else is going to the feds. They'll dismantle the organization, arrest whoever they can catch. It's over. And me? You disappear. New identity, new life, somewhere far from here. I've arranged for accounts, blood money, yes, but money that can give you a fresh start. Use it to become someone your father would have been proud of, not someone who defined herself by his death. Carmen laughed bitterly. You think money fixes this? No, Richard said. But it's all I have to offer. That and a promise that this ends here. No more retaliation, no more revenge, no more cycle. We both step out of it and never look back. She was quiet for a long time, processing. Then, Marco. Does he hate me? He's hurt, Richard said honestly.
Confused.
But I think part of him still cares about you, or at least the version of you that he knew. Whether that's enough to build something from, whether you even want to try, that's between you and him. I won't stand in the way. Carmen nodded slowly, then stood up, wiping her face with the back of her hand. She looked young again, no longer the hardened assassin but just a woman in her 20s who'd lost too much and survived anyway. I'll think about it, she said finally. The fresh start. The walking away. All of it. She picked up her rifle, not to aim it but just to hold it. But don't mistake mercy for forgiveness, Richard. I'm not forgiving you. Not today. Maybe not ever. I don't expect forgiveness, Richard said. I just hope that someday you find peace. Carmen walked past him, pausing at the church's broken entrance. You know what my father used to tell me? He said that good men don't end up in this life. Only men who were good once, before the world broke them. I used to think he was making excuses. Now. She looked back at Richard. Now I wonder if maybe breaking is a choice we keep making over and over until we finally decide to stop. And then she was gone, disappearing into the night like smoke. Richard stood alone in the ruined church, feeling lighter than he had in decades. He pulled out his phone and called Victor. "It's done," he said. "Boss, you okay?" "What happened?" "Everything changed," Richard said. "And nothing changed. I'll explain later. Right now, just make sure Marco's safe. And Mrs. Washington, make sure she gets home, and set up an account for her. Anonymous donation to her church's homeless ministry. Enough to keep them running for years." "How much?" "Everything," Richard said. "Everything I have left after Marco's taken care of. It's blood money, but maybe she can wash it clean by doing some actual good with it." He hung up before Victor could argue. 3 months later, Richard Don was living in a small apartment in Portland, Oregon, working as a building superintendent and going by the name Robert Donovan. It was mind-numbingly boring, fixing leaky faucets, dealing with noise complaints, picking up trash in the parking lot, and it was the best life he'd ever lived. Marco called every Sunday. He was teaching history at a high school in Vermont, living in a modest apartment, dating a woman who taught kindergarten and had no idea who his father had been. He sounded happy. Carmen had taken the money and disappeared, as far as Richard could tell. No sightings, no threats, no attempts at revenge. Maybe she'd found her fresh start. Maybe she was still out there somewhere, hating him but choosing not to act on it. Either way, the cycle was broken. And Mary Washington sent him Christmas cards. The first one arrived in December, addressed to Robert Donovan, with a handwritten note inside. "Even God's most lost children can find their way home. Praying for you always, Mary." Richard kept it on his refrigerator, next to a photo of Marco from graduation that his son had sent. They were his only decorations, his only connections to the life he'd left behind. Some nights, he dreamed about the people he'd killed. Their faces, their names, the moments when their eyes went dark. He'd wake up sweating, guilt crushing his chest like a physical weight. But other nights, he slept soundly, dreamlessly, peacefully. Those were the nights when he remembered that he'd chosen to stop, that he'd faced his greatest enemy and walked away, that he'd broken the cycle not because it was easy, but because it was right. Mary Washington had been correct about one thing. Stopping the cycle required being bigger than your worst impulses. It required choosing healing over hurt, mercy over revenge, possibility over certainty. It required being brave enough to be ordinary. And for the first time in 3 decades, Richard Don, former mob boss, killer, monster, was learning what it meant to be just a man. Flawed, broken, trying to make up for unfixable mistakes by living one small, decent day at a time. It wasn't redemption. Not really. But it was something. And sometimes something was enough. Thank you for watching the story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as can ever imagine. So, do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.